Hey everyone, welcome to Wandering Jews with Mijal and Noam. So this is our last episode in our month of re-releases, and we are psyched to come back next month with an awesome theme of episodes. But meanwhile, Mijal, what is our re-release about today?
This is a good one, and one that unfortunately continues to be so relevant. This was our episode about Holocaust education with brilliant thinker and writer Dara Horn. We spoke to Dara right before Yom HaShoah, and together we explored the rise in Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism post-October 7th, and why understanding Jewish identity is essential to understanding anti-Semitism, and why, I would add here, talking about Judaism is essential to combating anti-Semitism.
Yeah, it's an episode that's evergreen in so many ways. It's the type of content that could be listened to a year from now, 2 years from now, to think differently about Holocaust education. Now, I found it so interesting. I love the dialogue we were able to have with listeners afterwards. It really sparked just great conversations. And I hope it sparks conversations at the educational level, at the day school level, non-Jewish schools, Jewish schools, doesn't matter, of how people are thinking about, talking about, and teaching about the Holocaust. As you all know, being in touch with you is our favorite part for both me and Mijal. So email us at wanderingjews@unpacked.media. And looking forward to next week as we launch our next unit. With that, on to the show.
Well, this episode is coming out the week of Yom HaShoah, in which we mourn the Holocaust. So we were thinking about who do we want to have here talking with us, discussing this with us. And we couldn't think of a better person to have than Dara Horn. We're so excited to have you here, Dara. Dara is an award-winning author of 6 books, including several novels and the essay collection People Love Dead Jews. Dara, I want to know how you came up with that title. She's had a lot of essays and nonfiction work and articles appearing in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and many other publications. She's also, I want to just highlight here, not only somebody who's written about how people love dead Jews in the past, but also has been involved in some very contemporary and very visible questions around anti-Semitism, especially at Harvard, which we might talk about. And most recently, Dara is the founder and the president of a new nonprofit, Mosaic Persuasion, which is devoted to educating the broader American public about Jewish civilization. Dara, it's really great to have you here.
Thank you so much. It is a total treat to be with both of you. Thank you for having me.
Well, Dara, can I just ask you, how did you come up with the title of People Love Dead Jews?
Oh, gosh. Well, so I actually just want to say at the top that, you said I'm author of 6 books. As of this month, I'm an author of 7 books because I just put out a new book called One Little Goat, A Passover Catastrophe, which is a graphic novel for kids with a Passover theme. So I'll just put that over here. But we're going to talk about, we're back to dead Jews. Here we are.
Everybody go and buy Dara's 7 books. And now,
yeah, Dara, I was going to say the One Little Goat, that story is about a lot of destruction as well. So,
yes,
so do people love dead goats?
I mean, yeah, well, it's the goat of the book is the scapegoat, the reason for everyone's problems. Right. So, yes, and guides the main character through it's sort of a tour of Jewish history. So, yes, it's very on brand for me. So, Mijal, so the title "People Love Dead Jews," which I still cannot believe my publisher let me keep this title. This came from actually a piece that's in the book that I published a few years prior to that, which was, back in 2018, I was approached by Smithsonian Magazine, who asked me to write a piece for them about Anne Frank. And I remember getting this assignment and just being overwhelmed with dread because I'm like, wow, really don't feel like writing 5,000 word pious essay about Anne Frank that's going to be distributed in doctors' offices across America, which is what happens to Smithsonian Magazine. And I thought, normal people would have turned this assignment down, but I'm a writer, so I'm not a normal person. And instead I thought well, this is interesting, right? Why don't I want to write about this? And that was when I remembered this news story I had seen about something that had happened at the Anne Frank Museum. Again, this was back in 2018. There was a young Jewish man who was working at that museum, and the museum would not allow him to wear his yarmulke to work. They made him hide it under a baseball hat. He appealed this decision to the board of the museum. Board of the museum deliberated for 6 months and then relented and let him wear his yarmulke to work. And I had seen this news story and I just thought wow, 6 months is a really long time. For the Anne Frank Museum, to ponder whether or not it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. And, I was thinking, like, did this really happen? Did I dream this? And, then I went and looked it up and I saw, first of all, yeah, it really happened, but also something equally stupid had happened at the same museum 6 months earlier, 2017. It's a big international museum. They've got, 15 languages for their audio guide. And, there's that place where you pick up or download your audio guide and it says English and there's a British flag, Francais, French flag, Hebrew. No flag. No flag. The museum has since changed this and corrected this, but I just thought, something interesting is going on here. And so then I went back to Smithsonian and I'm like, I will write this article for you. And it was not the article they expected because it was about these kinds of, shenanigans that were being done in the memory of the Holocaust. And the very first line of that piece was, people love dead Jews, living Jews, not so much. And, I kind of just thought I was getting this out of my system, but I just sort of kept finding myself in situations like this where my editors at, mainstream general interest magazines and newspapers kept asking me to write about dead Jews. And I just thought, there's something deeper going on here that I wanted to dig into, and that was what.
Dara, can you say sharply what is your thesis around why people love dead Jews more than living ones?
Yes. So ultimately, the conclusion of that book is that people only appreciate Jews in a non-Jewish society when Jews are powerless.
Dead means powerless?
Powerless. So yes. So whether that means politically impotent or dead. That is the way that Jews are universally acceptable in a non-Jewish society, is when they do not have any power. So this is a long, complicated idea. I can pull out more for you, but it was basically what I realized is, the original conclusion of that book are twofold. It's people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel good about themselves, and then the second half of that is living Jews have to erase themselves in order to gain public respect. But ultimately, and this is something I've been thinking about much more since I published that book, is that it really is about that Jews are only acceptable if they have no power.
Wow. I really want us to go and speak about the way the Holocaust is taught and thought about. But before that, let me just quickly come to this current moment. With that thesis that you have, that Jews are loved or acceptable in non-Jewish society when they are powerless, how does this, I know it's a big question, apologies, but how are you interpreting this moment in terms of the rise of anti-Semitism post-October 7th? Because on the one hand, you would think October 7th, greatest massacre of Jews, lots of dead Jews, unfortunately, a lot of a sense of powerlessness, and at the same time, tremendous rise in anti-Semitism. So how do you understand that?
Because Jews have sovereignty, and that is unacceptable.
So if this would have happened, God forbid, a massacre like this, but without sovereignty, it would have drawn sympathy. But because it happened and then sovereignty and Jews fought back, that made it unacceptable.
Yes, Jews are not allowed to have power. So, you don't have to hypothesize about this. If it can be attached to Jews having power, that, basically anything after the Holocaust is Jews, anything after the foundation of the State of Israel, you can already tie this back to the existence of the State of Israel, which is a situation where Jews have sovereignty.
Why do people not like you when we have power?
This is a longer answer. Do you want me to dive into that now? Are we going to go there?
On 1 foot. Yeah. 1 foot.
Yeah, well, on 1 foot. I actually, and this is part of the foundational things that I'm digging into with my new organization as we develop these materials, for a broader, for schools and for a broader American public. We are approaching this through foundations of Jewish civilization and dynamics of anti-Semitism, and I actually feel that those two things are connected. And generally, when we think about describing anti-Semitism, we tend to describe it with this, we talked about the goat before, this scapegoat model where it's, these are Jews are an easy target, like any minority and that sort of thing. I actually think that there's something foundational to Jewish civilization that is also part of this dynamic. And I'm going to explain this, but and I'm still working on the language to describe this. If you think about what the foundations of Jewish civilization, the most fundamental idea in Judaism is monotheism, right? Belief in one God, resistance to idolatry. And today we think of that as this spiritual idea, right? A religious idea, emotional idea. in the ancient Near Eastern context, it is a political idea. Because all of these other, surrounding ancient Near Eastern societies have many, many gods, and one of the gods is the dictator. We see that in the Passover story, and I'm not citing the Passover story as historical, I'm citing it as, part of the foundational legend of how we Jews think about their own origins. But it is true, if in Egyptology, that the pharaoh is considered one of the gods, right? Pharaoh is a manifestation of the gods, right? And this is a very common thing for the dictator to be one of the gods. So if you think about that context, then when the Jews say that they don't bow to idols or they don't bow to other gods, what the Jews are actually saying is that they don't bow to tyrants. So, this is ultimately, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, are this anti-tyrannical movement. Does not, obviously do not always live up to that ideal. No one ever lives up to their ideals, unfortunately. But, this is ultimately founded as this anti-tyrannical movement. This is a radical concept. And this concept pisses off tyrants. It pisses off tyrants. And it's more than just that, because it's an anti-tyrannical movement. It's a non-expansionist movement. This is not a proselytizing movement, right? This isn't a movement that thinks, oh, I'm right and everyone else is wrong and everybody else has to come agree with me. A lot of other cultures are, right? There's, other cultures that are imperial, right? Whether that's politically imperial, whether they're conquering land, or whether that's, ideologically imperial, where, everybody has to follow my beliefs or my ideology. Or even if it's just something, more benign and passive, it's a dominant society where everybody is part of the same culture. And, Jews are this counterculture that runs through world history of people who are refusing to conform. And that pisses off dominant societies that need to be validated by everyone agreeing with them. So, this is ultimately this sort of message about freedom and nonconformity that is intolerable to many societies that don't have the self-confidence to not need every single person on the planet to agree with them.
So there, yeah.
So that was a lot.
But I want to. There's a paradox in that thesis. I was following it. I was actually taking notes as you were saying. I was trying to deeply understand what you were saying. There seems to then be a paradox in your thesis, which is if the whole vision of Judaism is to be countercultural and be anti-tyrannical, then what happens when the Jews become the majority and become the culture? Then how does that work?
Oh, so monotheism is not the only core foundational concept here. It's the one that I'm highly, I was told to do this on one foot.
Well, by the way, I'm so happy that I witnessed that whole thing happen, because Mijal is a major scholar and you're a major scholar. And when I asked Mijal to explain things on one foot, she's like, I don't want to do that. So now that Mijal asked you to do it, I love it. I like watching you guys work through that.
Well, we all have to do as educators, right? This is key component of education. It's like, turn it into something that fits on a fortune cookie. That's what we're all kind of doing. So if you think about, the content of this civilization, it isn't just monotheism. It isn't counterculture for the sake of counterculture. It's a counterculture in the context of all these other cultures that are, taking this imperial approach, right? It's not a counterculture just for the sake of opposition. It's not that. It's, but the content of this civilization, there's a lot of things, right? I mean, I don't have to tell anyone, probably don't have to tell a lot of people listening to this. But, I mean, if I wanted to highlight some basic ones, one that's relevant here is the idea of constructive disagreement becomes central to Jewish civilization, right? Not at exactly the same moment as the introduction of monotheism. It develops later. But that's the whole foundation of the rabbinic tradition, is this idea of civil discourse, right? Like, why is the Talmud 3,000 pages long? It's because it includes everyone's opinions, not only the opinions of the people who won the argument, right? The whole concept of machloket l'shem shamayim, argument for the sake of heaven, right? The idea that, that the argument itself is a sacred act, right? The idea of this constant engagement with what is the meaning of Torah, right? What is the meaning of the basis in text? Right? I mean, there's a lot of things past, like, oh, we believe in one God, we reject tyrants, we reject idolatry. It's a lot of things past that. And those things also stem, but those things do stem from the idea of monotheism, because even if you think about what is that whole rabbinic tradition about, all those debates that we're having, the whole idea of interpreting the laws, like, where are these, if you think about these laws as coming from this covenant with God. And, again, I'm not making a spiritual argument here. I'm not saying about, this is about a civilization. It is irrelevant whether or not you believe in God, whether or not you engage with this on some sort of, emotional or spiritual level. I'm making a historical claim. If you look at the laws in the Torah, there are similarities to other societies. If you look at Hammurabi's law and you look at some of the laws that are in the Torah, they're very similar. Here's what's different about it. What happens when Hammurabi dies? What happens when his dynasty falls? Right? I mean, these are laws that are attached, again, to, maybe a more benevolent dictator, but these are laws that are still attached to a human ruler who is assumed to have the absolute power to be able to even, grant the people these rules. Right? This is a very different concept of how you build a civil society, where there's this concept of law that is outside of any individual or any person holding on to power. So that is, it's a very different concept from what you have in the ancient Near East.
So Dara, I just want to take a step back. So you were explaining right now, first of all, how important it is to understand Jewish civilization,
yes.
Not just anti-Semitism. But you were explaining that the more totalitarian-like a society is, and the less confident it is in its own identity, the less tolerance it has for Jews who are non-conformists, especially when they have power, because it threatens, right, totalitarianism, it threatens the rule of a dictator-like ruler. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes, and I'm excited for my dissertation defense where...
Okay, great.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, so how do we explain this rise in anti-Semitism in America right now, which is still a liberal democracy, not a totalitarian regime, and where many of us, we don't tend to think in an everyday way that we are facing, a totalitarian culture. We think we are facing a diverse culture with many ways of being, and the Jews are just one more flavor to this. So how do you, with your thesis, how do you explain not everything we've seen in the polls? Let me just read some polls to you. Roughly 7 in 10 Jewish adults report experiencing anti-Semitism online or on social media in the last, since October 7th. If you go younger, it's 83%. It goes even higher. 77% of American Jews say they feel less safe as Jews in the U.S. because of October 7th. I think it's undeniable, and you live this, at Harvard, in a very particular way. So how does your thesis play out in America, this contemporary liberal democracy?
Oh, absolutely. So when I say that this civilization is a threat to people who want to maintain power, that can look a lot of different ways. So it can look like a political, like a dictatorship. I think, and in that case, that is relevant here because if you think about what is happening in the Middle East, this is driven by autocratic regimes, right? I mean, if you think about Hamas as a franchise of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic Republic of Iran, if you think about, Hezbollah as that, if you think of the Houthis as that, I mean, if you think of it about this whole sort of ring of fire around the state of Israel, this is all, created exclusively by autocratic regimes that are trying to cling to power. So that piece is there. And also you see the influence of those regimes in our online life in the West. And, that's, absolutely undeniable that you have, autocratic regimes overseas that are influencing our discourse here. So that is one piece of it. However, when I say people who want to maintain power, it does not have to be that direct and that openly explicit. It does not have to be an authoritarian regime. It can be the kids in the middle school who need to stay being the popular kids. Right? I mean, it can be, right? It can be these, people who are, disenfranchised feeling, people in the United States who feel like, whatever I consider my group used to be, on top in this hierarchy of this society, and now we aren't anymore, and we've been unjustly demoted or something like that, right? It can be humanities professors who see that, their entire field has cratered. They've lost, all of the prestige and funding and graduate students and interest in their subjects, and, their students who they have are dwindling, and the ones that they do have can't even finish reading a book. And how do I maintain my relevancy? Right? I mean, this is, you know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't have to be as grand as, like, you know, a tyrannical regime. This is about people who need to maintain some semblance of feeling like they have some kind of power, and who are, you know, are feeling insecure in that. Yeah. So, I mean, it was a much broader idea than just, you know, the way that it looked in the ancient times where you had these, you know, regimes battling each other. It doesn't have to be that explicit. Yeah. I mean, this is just a group dynamic.
Right. So Dara, you're helping us understand how this can manifest even in a society like in America. So I want to actually shift a little bit and talk about America and talk about Holocaust education in America. And I would say for myself, I have read a lot of your work, Dara, and some other people's work that have really criticized the way that the Holocaust is taught, whether it's through major museums or in public schools or in other areas. And I do want to talk to you, Dara, and also to Noam, who does a lot of work in independent schools, and try to figure out what are, like, you know, worst practices and best practices in terms of Holocaust education. But before that, I actually want to ask an earlier question, because as I was preparing for this conversation, I realized that I wasn't sure that I could make the case as to why Holocaust education is important. Like I'm asking this genuinely. Why is Holocaust education for a non-Jewish audience important? I think that I used to have a gut reaction. If we teach about this, will help prevent it in the future. And I'm not sure that education and people work this way. I don't know. Again, I'm just being very honest here. I don't know if it works this way, that if we teach a people about a certain catastrophe, that will make sure they don't replicate it. So I'm just really curious, almost from like a first principles perspective. If you had to make the case as to why it is important to teach about the Holocaust, let's pretend for a second in the correct way, but why it's important to teach about the Holocaust to a non-Jewish audience, what would that reason be?
And before you answer that, I also just I think about that question often. We have to figure out what the goal is, right? And we'll get to the goal of what good Holocaust education would be. But I was thinking about this in a broader context outside the Jewish world of, well, there are other genocides throughout history, right? There's the Cambodian genocide from 75 to 79. There's the Armenian genocide from 1915 to 1917. There's the Rwandan genocide in 1994. There are multiple genocides, sadly, that have happened in the past 75 to 120 to 100 years or whatever it is. And so it's a question. Why is this important?
I mean, I was going to say there's also other genocides of Jews, right? If you think about, like, during the Russian Civil War, it was, you know, from 1918 to 1921, it's like minimum credible estimate of 100,000 Jews who were massacred in Ukraine during those years. Right. And actually directly relevant to the Holocaust, because it created this refugee crisis, which sent all these people to Western European capitals, which, you know, became this talking point for the Nazi regime, you know, rise to power 10 years later, because you had this like massive flood of penniless Jewish refugees in Western cities in Europe. So yeah, there's a lot I could say about this. But do you want me to sort of go into the history of this, or like really just go to first principles? I don't think you can do this without understanding the.
What's your take? Just what's your take? What's the reason?
I think that the reason that people have used, you want reason people have used, or reason that I think it's necessary?
Your reasons.
You.
To me, I think it makes no sense to teach about it without having a larger context of Jewish history and civilization. I don't see the purpose of it other than that, except that I think it has other purposes in terms of teaching about, like, you know, the rise of tyrannical regimes. I mean, those kinds of things. If you think about teaching about, you know, the use of the way new media works, the way that, you know, the very, you know, quickly how you can quickly change social norms by activating older social norms. Like, I mean, there are things like that you can bring into it. I think that it makes a lot of sense to teach about it if you are teaching a broader story of the role of Jews in Western civilization which frankly you can't understand Western civilization without understanding Jewish civilization and history. So I think in that case it has to be taught, right? I mean, and that is because this was an attempt to eradicate not only Jews but Jewish civilization. And this is a really interesting and powerful dynamic for the way that these, that Western societies think about themselves. And for that reason, it needs to, you need to understand it. But the problem that has emerged is like very different from all of those first principles questions. And it comes, look, I wrote a book called People of Dead Jews. That book came out at the end of 2021. I dove much deeper into this specific topic of Holocaust education for a piece I wrote for The Atlantic that came out in the spring of 2023. So before October 7th is important to note, but, and I was researching it mostly for the previous year. This was a piece that I spent about a year researching. I was traveling around the country, not just like going to museums, but like interviewing. I mean, I interviewed about 100 people for that piece, not all of whom made it into the piece. And, speaking with students in schools, speaking with teachers, meeting with people who create curricula for schools, meeting with people who are, legislators who pass mandates about this for state legislatures, meeting with museum designers, meeting, following people through going to teacher training events, going to conferences. And, this was a traveling around the country for this. So gigantic project. And it was just stunning to me to realize that the way this was actually being used in schools was as a case study in morality. This was a way of teaching morality in a secular context. And it was extracted from not just Jewish history, often from any kind of history. Sometimes it was taught in a social studies class in the context of world history or American history, but, or World War II. But often it was taught like in an, English language arts class around a book or something like that. And it was sort of taught in isolation, but certainly absolute isolation from Jewish life and history. And it was just striking that, there's like 28 states in this country where you're required to learn in school that Jews are people who were murdered in Europe during this period from 1933 to 1945. There's not, and I want to be clear, like, it should be 50 states. Like, I'm not making an argument against Holocaust education. I'm not saying that this shouldn't be taught or something like that. The problem to me is that there's not a single state in this country where anyone is required to learn who are Jews. And this is so glaring. I was at a conference for teachers over the summer at the Dallas Holocaust Museum. So there were some museums where I followed around students and I talked to students. But in this case, I was there in the summer for a teacher conference, so I didn't get to meet students. And so I asked the docents at this Holocaust Museum in Dallas, what do students typically ask when they come on their trips through the museum? The docents told me, you know what they ask? They ask, are there still Jews alive today? Because if you went to this museum, you kind of wouldn't know. You kind of wouldn't know. And it was just really striking.
So, Dara, what's the morality tale?
Jewish life. Sorry, yes.
You said it's a morality tale. What's the morality tale in these 28 schools in the states, where it's mandated? Yeah.
I mean, it is like you're using this to talk about how, basically, like, I mean, the worst version of it is like, this shows that people are really mean to each other and you should be nice. I mean, like, literally. Like, this is something like that. I mean, it's, there's actually one, I think it was a British Holocaust scholar who, in one of the things I read, raised this point where he said, essentially the lessons of the Holocaust, so to speak, that are being taught as, we should learn this from the Holocaust, that, people should be, kind to each other, are essentially the same lessons that were being taught in Germany in schools before World War II. Right? Like, you don't need genocide of 6 million people to tell you should love your neighbors, right? Like, this is something that's, I hate to say it, part of Jewish civilization that has influenced the history of the West. It's, also obviously, these are ideas that show up in a whole lot of cultures. Most cultures have some teachings about, being kind to neighbors, right? I mean, this is kind of absurd. So, yeah, that was, but what was really striking to me was this, like, absolute ignorance and total lack of interest in anything about who are Jews. And yeah, there's this idea in education called the null curriculum, right? Like null, like N-U-L-L, like zero, which is what's not taught in schools. And the reason, educators like to think about this is because the idea is that what's the null curriculum is also part of the curriculum. Because you're sending students a message by what you're not teaching. And the message isn't don't learn this. The message is don't learn this from me. So it's like sex education in schools a few generations ago, right? It would be, the teachers weren't saying don't learn about sex. They were saying learn about sex from your older brother instead of learning it from me. And so that is what this education system has done with Jewish civilization. This has been outsourced to TikTok.
Dara, I want to just make sure, I want to just sharpen to see if I understood what you're saying. And then I want to hear from Noam, just like worst things you've seen and like best things you've seen in terms of Holocaust education. But I think what I'm hearing you say, Dara, is that we've got a generation of young people that if they're exposed to the Holocaust, they're exposed to Jews only through the Holocaust in their formal education, where they learn of Jews as victims with simplistic morality tales and without any context about who Jews are, and they get that from like other sources, which I'm hearing a little bit an implication that for this to be done right, it would actually include something about this is who Jews are, these are some of the factors that led to the Holocaust, this is what the Holocaust did, and this is a little bit about who Jews are today, post-Holocaust as well. Am I understanding you right?
I think it's bigger than that.
Go for it.
It's bigger than that because a couple things. First of all, one problem is, as you say, like, this is what, look at what people did to the Jews. Jews are these totally passive victims. I got to say that is one of the reasons that is the sort of story that has sunk in and has really been latched onto by American educators in a non-Jewish context. I hate to say it because it's very resonant, I think, for people who have sort of this cultural Christian beliefs that they've imbibed with, whether they're religious Christians or not. Like, this is just part of the non-Jewish culture. This idea that, like, there was like some murdered Jew who died for your sins. That's
you're saying
like
it's attractive. There's something almost like attractive.
There's something that feels familiar about that, I think, to a lot of people in a deep cultural level that maybe, that's not even conscious, is this, attraction to this like idea of this like passive Jewish tortured victim. So I do think that there's a piece of that and that is something wonderful and redemptive, and that's going to make you, learning about that's going to make you a better person. That's like an idea that's like deep in Christianity that people aren't even conscious, I think, that they've inherited. So that's one piece. Another piece is that another problem with you teaching the Holocaust about in this way, and is that as you say, like with you were correct. I mean that this total erasure of Jewish life is that is very concordant with the Nazi project. The Nazi project wasn't about killing 6 million people who were just like you and me. The Nazi project was about erasing Jewish civilization. Making sure that there's no trace of Jewish civilization in any part of ours.
Right.
Even though
you're pointing out the irony of teaching about the Nazi project in a way that inadvertently reifies the same goal of only offering the Jews as victims and essentially erasing Jewish civilization and how the Holocaust is taught.
It's because, I mean, even the way it's taught, like where it's like, oh look, we're this Anne Frank, she's just like you and me. It's like, well, Anne Frank is actually a quite atypical Holocaust victim. Yeah. For like 10 different reasons, one of which is that like this is a person who's speaking a non-Jewish language, living in a Western country. I mean, like 85% of the Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers. Huge percentage of them were religious Jews, right? But it's like, those are the people that's the civilization that was destroyed in the Holocaust, was Ashkenazi Yiddish speaking civilization. And that is, there's only, some new versions of it and remnants of it that have been revived. But I mean, that is the civilization that was destroyed. So that's one piece of it. But then also another piece is that genocide, having anti-Semitism be introduced in the context of genocide.
I feel like we're giving people ideas, by the way.
What?
I feel like we're giving people ideas.
Yeah, well, I mean, seriously, that's what I do. I said that in People Love Dead Jews. I was like, you're giving people ideas about your standards.
Right.
Right? It's like, anything short of genocide is like, kind of looks great. Right? Like, it's like, the entire Muslim world, ethnically cleansed all of their Jews, had occasional massacres, ethnically cleansed all of their Jews, had centuries of basically Jim Crow-style segregation, and then in the modern period, expelled every last Jew from millions and millions of places, and millions of square miles of territory, all of Middle East and North Africa's Judenrein, and all of their assets were seized, and on the way out, many people, hundreds of people were massacred. That looks great compared to the Holocaust.
I get this, by the way, often as someone who studies Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. People will often, when I speak about the fact that Jews fled or were expelled or left due to fear, they will say, yeah, but it wasn't as bad as Christian Europe or the Holocaust. I'm like, yeah, that's like not the best, it's like the best point.
On the board here, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But also what it eliminates, and also teaching the Holocaust, and this is the biggest piece, and then I'm sorry to dabble a bit, but the biggest piece, the biggest problem here is if your goal in teaching the Holocaust is to combat anti-Semitism, teaching the Holocaust in isolation, even in the isolation of, even if you teach it about, we also include this stuff about, history of anti-Semitism in Christian Europe. Yay. Okay. Up to that. Even if you teach it, even with that, slightly longer context of we had a little lesson about the blood libel or something, you've eliminated the possibility of pattern recognition. Mm-hmm. There's no pattern recognition when the one case you're showing of anti-Semitism is mass murder. Because most anti-Semitism doesn't take the form of mass murder. And as you said, the fact that there isn't even a name for the destruction of all the Sephardi, every Sephardi and Mizrahi community on the planet except for 12. Right? That there isn't even a name for that.
Yeah.
That doesn't even have a word. Right? But also there's no pattern recognition for how does anti-Semitism work? Right? It's just don't hate people.
Right.
It's usually it doesn't look like hating people. It looks like defending your society's ideals.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely no way of teaching people that when you have zero context and you've deliberately eliminated the possibility of pattern recognition.
So let me actually use this as a jumping off point to ask Noam. Noam, you've done a lot of, you've been the principal of a Jewish school. Now you've done a lot of work in independent schools, really coming in and telling the Jewish story, often to a majority non-Jewish audience. Also, by the way, Unpacked is going to be doing a lot of new Holocaust videos. So I know you've thought a lot about Holocaust education. What would you say are top two bad things don't do that you've seen, and maybe some constructive recommendations or bright spots that you've seen about how to do this well?
So, yeah, I like that description of the Jewish and in the non-Jewish environment. I think we have to always. At the end of the day, I'm an educator. I just think about curriculum, about the end first, and then how you're going to arrive at the end. What's the goal? And then what are the activities to arrive at that goal? And the bad that I've seen, and when I say bad, I want to acknowledge that it still comes from a good place, but still, in my style of education, of what I'm trying to accomplish, not good. So number one is the instrumentalization of the Holocaust. I think that it's instrumentalized to accomplish something else in some curricula. Whether or not the goal of teaching the Holocaust, I'll give you a good example. Teaching the Holocaust as a way to teach about the bystander effect. I don't view that should be the goal of Holocaust education, to teach about the bystander effect. Do I think the bystander effect was a problem during the Holocaust? Of course it was. Do I think the Evian conference was a problem when you have Golda Meir sitting there as an observer and as a participant, and there were bystanders of dozens of countries? Yeah, I think it's a problem. But the goal is to teach what happened and in that moment, not to teach what happens when you're a bystander if someone doesn't share their applesauce with a friend of yours. That's an instrumentalization of the Holocaust in a way that I think is, frankly, inappropriate. It's also a problem, so that's number one. Problem number two is when teaching the Holocaust, I think Yair Rosenberg said this the first time, teaching the Holocaust as a way to teach anti-Semitism is like teaching slavery as a way to teach racism. It's such a silly thing to do when the learner on the other side will be like, okay, so it's not a big problem anymore. I slavery, bad. Of course, bad. It's bad. Genocide against your people, gas chambers, bad, for sure. But like, you guys are doing pretty well right now. It's a really, really strange way to teach these topics, and it kind of reduces the significance of them. So, and now I'm going to defend it for a second. This is my style. The value of doing these sorts of things is not even the value. The reason behind it is it's an attempt to universalize it. It's an attempt to say, hey, all 50 states in the United States of America should be teaching Holocaust education, and this is the best way to do it. It's a way to universalize what I believe is a very particular story.
And that's very American, Noam, I think, also, like the way that we, like to just universalize something, to make it apply to all Americans, to bring in like the role of America. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it is. And it's a way to, everyone needs to have a seat at the table, right? And so if we're going to, that's what my original question was, like, there should be, mandatory Cambodian genocide education, mandatory Armenian genocide education, mandatory, and then you start saying, well, no, here's why the Holocaust is really important to understand. And of course, those things are important to understand also, like the null curriculum. I'm not trying to minimize the value of learning history. Like, yeah, everyone should learn these stories. There is something different about the Holocaust, I believe. And it's important to name that and to see that. And Dara, you've done that already. You have to understand Jewish civilization to understand Western civilization in order to understand yourself, right? Like that's and what the future should therefore hold. It's all part of it's happened together. What I think is good, Mijal, is in two different ways. Again, think about the goal of a curriculum. If you're in a Jewish context, I really think it's important to ask theology questions, faith-based questions, and to say, how do we think about God and man in the context of such a tragedy to fall upon the Jewish people? How do we think about that? To ask national questions. Well, why is sovereignty so important? And then to understand the context of the pogroms and the Holocaust and the like. Why are these things so important to Jews, theologically and nationally? And then a broader question, which I think is important for everyone to understand, is the history of this time period. This is good for everyone to understand the history surrounding it, to understand how it could happen, to understand that it actually can only happen. I remember saying this to when I was the principal of the school, the top history teacher said to us, this, like when people asked, how could this happen in Germany? His answer was, it could only happen in Germany. And it was a fascinating understanding then of how a mechanized slaughter like this could potentially take place. I think a good curriculum will include the fact that, like kind of like Dara is saying, is here's what happens when it's viewed as though the Jews have an exaggerated sense of power, and that's the pattern throughout history, that there's an exaggerated sense of power that Jews have, and here's the result of when you have a misunderstanding of the Jewish people. Like, there's a lot of good education. The first thing though that I'll say though, the last thing that I'll say though is, here's the first goal, and Dara said this also already. When we're creating Holocaust education, you know what the first video that we're making about Holocaust education is? And Dara knows this, I think, is, who are the Jews? What does it mean to be Jewish? Like, what is this? That is part of Holocaust education. And it is so true that without understanding who the Jews are and what Judaism is, you can't understand the Holocaust. And without understanding the Holocaust, in my opinion, you can't understand the Jews. But when you have those theological questions mixed in with those historical questions, like David Weiss-Halivni talked about the two great revelations. And the students understand it's the revelation of Sinai and the revelation of God's presence. And Auschwitz is the revelation of God's absence. And that's a really, really powerful thing to understand in a Jewish context. So those are the different bads and the goods of the way I see of Holocaust education.
Right, and I like now how you're framing that some things are important in like Jewish educational settings and some in broader educational settings. Our time is going to run out soon, but I have two questions for you before we finish. One is that even though I really like the title of your book, I wish I didn't, but people love Dead Jews. It's very compelling. But there is a growing number of people who don't like Dead Jews even. So I'm thinking right now about like a lot of like Holocaust denialism, at the fact that, Candace Owens and like others have such huge followings, like in podcasts, the fact that you had some Tucker Carlson having people who were like, I don't know if they're like Holocaust deniers, but like World War II denialists of sorts. So there is like a growing number of people who are fueled by social media, denying the Holocaust. How can you explain the rise of that? Because I would be like, come on, like, that Jews, we should have that.
Well, okay, so the people of dead Jews argument is about, exactly as Noam said, the instrumentalization of the murders of Jewish communities. So that is part of that instrumentalization is to serve your purposes. But to your question, Mijal, about denial, the basis of anti-Semitism is denial. The promotion of truth and the promotion of lies at the expense of truth is the foundation of anti-Semitism. The way that my new nonprofit frames the idea of anti-Semitism is around the idea of the big lie. And in other words, that all anti-Semitism is better understood and rather than as just a social prejudice, that this is and it's not even just a conspiracy theory, it is a lie. And conspiracy theories are one example of that. Holocaust denial, as you point out, is a huge example of that. So is denial of the atrocities on October 7th is an example of that. The whole, somehow magically Jewish civilization is not native to the land of Israel is an example of that, right? All of these are attempts to deny the reality of Jewish life and experience. And all of these lies are in service of the foundational big lie. The foundational big lie is Jews are the obstacle to whatever you value most. And therefore, Jews are collectively evil and shouldn't exist. That is the foundational big lie of anti-Semitism that you can pull through all of Jewish history. It predates Christianity. You see it in ancient Greece and Rome and other ancient civilizations prior to Christianity and Islam. You can pull it through to post-Holocaust, because this is another thing. Is Noam just spoke very eloquently about ways you can frame this in a Jewish context. A way that I think is essential if you care about combating anti-Semitism to frame it in a non-Jewish context is to talk about broader political movements of anti-Semitism after the Holocaust. Right. And if the through line is Jews are the obstacle to whatever your society values most, what changes is simply what your society values most. So there's a society that that during the period of let's say post-Enlightenment leading up to the Holocaust is the rise of science as this universal value that everyone should value most, and then the distortion of that is this pseudo-racial science, right? This bogus, quote, science of science just determined that Jews are an inferior race, right? But that was already replacing a previous version of what your society values most, which would be something like, let's say Christianity or Islam, depending on where you are, and that's the supreme, wonderful, supposedly universal value, right? The Jews are somehow corrupting or polluting or disrupting. Right. But I think you can pull this past World War II to see you can pull this past World War II to see other strains of it. You see it in the way that we teach this. We do actually two sections that are post World War II in the dynamics of anti-Semitism. And one, we look at international institutions that rise after World War II, and we look at the Soviet Union and anti-Zionism and the framing of anti-Zionism as Zionism is now this disruption to what your society values most, which is these international groups like the Comintern, in that case, the Soviet bloc, right, where we're all supposed to be workers united without nations or something like that. And then you have other versions of that in other, the Arab League and things like that. But then you also can look at a 21st century version of this, where you look at after the fall of the Soviet Union, the new thing that's universal is human rights and the rise of non-governmental organizations. And when I say non-governmental organizations, two forms of that, right? One is, what we think of as, charitable organizations or non-governmental watchdog type organizations or political organizations, and also non-state actors, as we would say, right? I mean, are part of that, and the rise of Iran as a regional superpower in the Middle East, and how they're able to move into the former Soviet Union's takeover. But then what has happened is that we have a whole section on the Durban Conference, where, and I mean, that is a direct line. When you look at the Durban Conference, as the United Nations Conference Against Racism in 2001 in Durban, South Africa, which became this anti-Semitic hate fest.
Right.
So that conference was, captured by Iran. Anyway, there's more I can say about this. I'll stop. But when you talk about the rise of Holocaust denial, that is consistent with this entire pattern of anti-Semitism going back to ancient times, which is this pattern of, that basically that it's foundational on this lie, which is based on denying the reality of Jewish identity and civilization.
Yeah. So we tend to finish our conversations with like asking, so new, what now? Trying to tease out like, big ideas, tangible implications. There's so many here that I'm like struggling with, only highlighting a couple, but I'll just say maybe one big one, Dara, that you are really raising over and over again is this assertion that we cannot teach about the Holocaust without teaching about Jewish civilization, who Jews are, who we were, and also like who we are like in recent years, and what makes us who we are, what makes us a nonconformist element, why are we threatening, all of these things. It is so critical to approach it in this way. So I think this is a really important idea for all of us to keep in mind as we go into Yom HaShoah and as we continue to think what it means to advocate for like, strong, good Holocaust education, in this country.
Amazing. Yeah.
Amazing. And so good to have you here, Dara. So grateful. Everybody buy Dara's full 7 books. They're all really, really great.
One little go, a father in heaven with 2 luchot.
Yeah. There we go.
All right, listen, Wandering Jews is a production of Unpacked, a brand of OpenDor Media. Today's episode was hosted by me, Noam Weissman.
And me, Mijal Biton.
The team for this episode includes Rob Pera, Rifki Stern, Ari Schlacht, and Ryan Rabinowitz. As always, we'd love to hear what this conversation sparked for you. If you have disagreements, if you have agreements, if you have thoughts that we did not consider, shoot us a note. Be in touch with us. Email us at wanderingjews@unpack.media. Again, wanderingjews@unpack.media. And of course, find us on social at Wandering Jews. Thanks so much, Mijal. See you next week.